gonna check underneath the bus as I'm approaching it. Make sure there's no wires or hoses hanging from underneath. Also, no debris. If there's debris, I would remove it. Make sure the bus is not leaning from one side to the other. If it is, that indicates there's a busted shot, a busted or missing leaf spring, or a low or flat tire. I'm gonna check my marker lights, turn signals, headlights, fog lights. Make sure they're all securely mounted. Not missing any bolts or screws, nor are they cracked, broke, chipped, or missing. Check my windshield, side windows. Make sure they're not cracked, broke, chipped, or missing. Check the rubber stripping, weather stripping. Make sure it's not cracked, dry rotted, cut, or missing. Check the mirror mounts. Make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the mirrors. Make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. None are they cracked, broke, chipped, or missing. Check the defrost wires. Make sure they're securely mounted, not cut, frayed, or burned. Check the tension on this wiper blade on. Check the bolts to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the blade. Make sure it's not cut, dry rotted, cracked, or missing. Check the hinges on this door to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the wiring to make sure it's not cut, frayed, or burned. Check the hose to make sure it's not cut or leaking. Check the washer motor to make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the tension on this wiper blade on to make sure it's proper tension. Check the bolts to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the blade, make sure it's not cracked, dry rotted, cut, or missing. Check the hinges on this door to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the wiring to make sure it's not cut, frayed, or burned. Check the washer hose to make sure it's not cut or leaking. Check the washer motor to make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check this marker light to make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws, nor is it cracked, broke, chipped, or missing. Check the mirror mounts to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the mirrors to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws, nor are they cracked, broke, chipped, or missing. Check the defrost wires to make sure they're securely mounted, not cut, frayed, or burned. Check this driver's side mirror to make sure it opens properly, to make sure the glass is not cracked, broke, chipped, or missing. Check the hinges on this door to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check all the wires to make sure none of the wires are cut, frayed, or burned, and also checking for excessive corrosiveness. Check the breakers to make sure they're not tripped. I'm going to check the fuses to make sure they're not burned. If so, burn out. If so, we have some in the emergency compartment. Check the hinges on this door to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts and screws. I'm going to check the frame, make sure it's not twisted or bent. Make sure there's no holes or excessive rust. I'm going to check the drag link and pitman arms to make sure they're secure. They're not twisted or bent. Make sure they're secured with a caster nut and a cotter pin. We check the gearbox to make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. We check the hoses to the gearbox to make sure they're not cut or leaking. I'm going to check the U-joints to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. I'm going to check the steering column to make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws, nor is it twisted or bent. Check the windshield washer reservoir. Make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. I'm going to check the wires on it, make sure they're not cut, frayed, or burned. I'm going to check the hose to make sure it's not cut or leaking. Check this reflector tape, make sure it's not peeling or missing. Check the emergency exit to make sure it's properly labeled. Check this turn signal Make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Nor is it cracked, broke, chipped, or missing. I'm going to check the leaf spring hangers to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. I'm going to check the bushings to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. I'm going to check the leaf springs to make sure they're not shifted, cracked, broke, or missing. I'm going to check the brake chamber, make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Make sure it's not dented or leaking. I'm going to check the push rod to make sure it's not bent or broken. I'm going to check the slack adjuster to make sure it has less than 1 inch of play with the brakes released. I'm going to check the brake pads for thinning, make sure they're not cracked, broke, or missing. I'm going to check the brake drum for thinning and make sure it has no illegal welds. Make sure it's not cracked or dented. I'm going to check the hub seal, make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws, nor is it leaking. I'm going to check the lug nuts to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any lug nuts. I'm going to check the threads for shiny threads and rust drippings that would indicate there's a loose lug nut. Check the rim, make sure it's not cracked or dented, has no illegal welds. We'll check the tire sidewall to make sure it has no abrasions, bruises, or cuts. We'll check the valve stem, make sure it's secure and in place. Check the tire pressure, make sure it's 105 pounds of pressure with a tire thumper or a tire pressure gauge if I had one. We'll check the tire tread, make sure it's even and has no less than 4/32 of tread. You can't run retreads in the front. We'll check the shock absorber to make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the ABS wire to make sure it's not cut, frayed, or burned. Check the air hose to make sure it's not cut or leaking. Check both air tanks, make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws, nor are they dented or leaking. Check the hose to the air tanks, make sure it's not cut or leaking. Check the mud flap to make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check this marker light, make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Nor is it cracked, broke, chipped, or missing. Check the reflector tape to make sure it's not peeling or missing. Check the hinges on this bay door, make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the shock absorbers to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws, nor are they twisted, bent, or leaking. Check the bay floor for hose and excessive rust. Check the frame, make sure it's not twisted, bent, has any holes or excessive rust. Check this bay door hinges, make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the shock absorbers to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws, nor are they twisted, bent, or leaking. Check the bay fluid for excessive rust and holes. Check the leaf spring hangers to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the bushings to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the leaf springs to make sure they're not shifted, broke, cracked, or missing. Check the U-bolts to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the brake chamber, make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws, nor is it dented or leaking. Check the push rod to make sure it's not bent or broken. Check the slack adjuster, make sure it has less than 1 inch of play with the brakes released. Check the brake pads or brake shoes for thinning, make sure they're not cracked, broke, or missing. Check the brake drum for thinning, and illegal welds to make sure it's not dented or cracked. Check the hub seal, make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws nor they're leaking. Check the lug nuts to make sure they're securely mounted. And check the threads, the shiny threads or rust drippings. That would indicate there's a loose lug nut. Check the rim for illegal welds and make sure it has no dents, cracks. Check the valve stems on both tires. Make sure there's a valve stem cap in place and tight. Check the air pressure on both tires to make sure it's 105 pounds of pressure with a tire pressure gauge or a thumper if I had one. Check the tire sidewalls on both tires. Make sure there's no abrasions, bruises, or cuts. Check in between the tires to make sure there's no debris, if so I would remove it. Check the tread wear on both tires to make sure it's even. Make sure the tread wear, there's no less than 230 seconds of tread wear, and you can run retreads in the back. Check the shock absorber to make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the air bellow to make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the hose to the air bellow to make sure it's not cut or leaking. Check the differential, make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the U-joints in the drive shaft, make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Also make sure that the drive shaft is not twisted or bent. Check the mud flap, make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check this marker light to make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws, nor is it cracked, broke, chipped, or missing. Check the reflector tape to make sure it's not peeling or missing. Check the hinges on this door, make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check all the wires to make sure they're not cut, frayed, or burned, and also check for excessive corrosiveness. Check the turbocharger to make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check to make sure there's a rubber hose and a hose clamp in place. Make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the alternators and the air conditioning compressors to make sure they're all securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the exhaust hangers to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the exhaust system for black soot. If there's black soot, that indicates there's an exhaust leak. Stand at the back of the bus to make sure there's no wires or hoses hanging from under the bus. Also, make sure there's no fluids dripping from underneath the bus. And I'd also check to make sure there's no debris hanging from under the back of the bus. If so, I would remove it. Check my marker lights, turn signals, marker light, brake light, reverse light, marker light, brake light, / tag light. Make sure they're all securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. No, they're cracked, broke, chipped, or missing. Check the reflector tape. Make sure they're not peeling or missing. Check the hinges on this door. Make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the shock absorbers to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Nor are they twisted, bent, or leaking. Check the emergency lights to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Nor are they cracked, broke, chipped, or missing. Check the wiring. Make sure all the wires are securely mounted, not cut, frayed, or burned. Check the radiator reservoir. Make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the cap on the radiator reservoir to make sure it's tight and secure. Check the sight glass to make sure it's between add and full. Check the air filter indicator. make sure it's in the green. Check the water pump, power steering pumps, make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the belts, make sure none of the belts are dry rotted, cracked, cut, or missing. Make sure they have between a 1/2 inch and 3/4 inches of play. Check the air compressor, make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws, and also it's gear driven. Check the engine oil level and the transmission levels, make sure they're between add and full. Check the power steering reservoir to make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the hose to the power steering reservoir to make sure it's not cut or leaking. Check the radiator fan to make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws, nor are the blades cracked, broke, chipped, or missing. You stand back, take an overall look at all the wires, make sure they're securely mounted, make sure none of the wires are cut, frayed, or burned. Look at the hoses, make sure the hoses are not cut or leaking or bulging. Make sure they all have a hose clamp in place to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. There's things on this side of the bus that I'm going to check that wasn't on the other side. I'm going to check the engine block plug to make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. We check the radiator, make sure it's free of debris and not leaking any engine coolant. Check the radiator grill, make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws, make sure it's free of debris. Check the battery box door to make sure it's securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the battery tray, make sure there's no holes or excessive rust. Make sure there's a guide wire in place. Check the battery cables to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. We'll check cables for excessive corrosiveness. The batteries are maintenance free. If they wasn't, I check the battery fluid levels on the batteries. Check the hinges on the fuel door to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the fuel cap, make sure it's secure and in place. Check the fuel neck, make sure it's not twisted or bent, and make sure there's no excessive rust. Check the fuel straps, make sure they're securely mounted, make sure they're not missing. And also I'm going to check underneath the bus to make sure there's no fuel leaking under the bus. I'm going to check the exit light, step light to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. No other crack, broke, chipped, or missing. Check the running floors, steps, make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the door handles to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the glass in the door, make sure it's not cracked, broke, chipped, or missing. Check the leather stripping around the glass and in the door, make sure it's not cracked, dry rotted, cut, or missing. Check the seats. Make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the air ducts to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the emergency exit, make sure it opens properly. I'm going to check the heating and cooling, air conditioning and heating coolers to make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws, nor are they leaking any coolant.
I'm sorry.
Check the air ducts here and here, make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. We have emergency exit here and here. Check this emergency window, make sure it's open, secure. We'll check red box down here, make sure we have 3 reflective triangles. Check this box here, make sure we have 3 fuses. the hinges on the emergency compartment. Make sure they're securely mounted, not missing any bolts or screws. Check the wires to make sure they're not cut, frayed, or burned. Check the fire extinguisher to make sure it's fully charged. Check the first aid and body fluid kits to make sure they're fully stocked. Check the seat belt. Make sure it works properly. Make sure it's not cut or frayed. At this time, I like to do a series of brake tests. The first one being 1 minute, the 3-pound air loss. I'm going to turn the key switch on. The ABS light came on and went off. That indicates that's working properly. At this time, I'm going to make sure the vehicle's in neutral. Put on the brake. Take the parking brake off and hold the brake for approximately a minute. I lose any air pressure there, therefore that indicates that's a successful brake test. At this time, I'd like to do my emergency alarm, emergency spring brake test. I'm going to fan the brakes until the brake pressure gets down to 60 psi. At that time, the alarm will sound, an alarm light will come on. The light came on, the alarm came on, it sounded. We'll continue fanning until the pressure gets down between 20 and 40 psi. The spring brake knob should pop. It popped, and that also indicates that's a successful brake test. At this time, I'd like to practice a safe start. My foot's on the brake, parking brake's on, vehicle's in neutral. I'm going to build the RPMs up to 1200 RPMs for a minute. The air pressure should build between 90 and 125 psi. Assist me in doing a light test.
Do me a favor, say what you're doing so I know.
Turn the headlights on, I check the bright lights, then I switch back to low beams, I check the fog lights, I check the left turn signal, the right turn signal, check the flashers. Now I'm checking left turn signal, right turn signal, check the flashes in the back. Checking the brake lights in the back. Checking the reverse light in the back. 20-inch steering wheel. It has less than 2 inches of play. This is my turn signal handle. This is my 4-way flasher switch here. This time I'd like to do a switch engaged indicator check. My boost pump on drive it either low, high, medium, or high and low and off. Door open, close. Headlight marker light switch. Panel light dimmer switch. Windshield wiper and washer fluid switch. Water temperature, oil pressure, RPMs. Mile per hour, fuel gauge, volts between 12 and 14 volts, air pressure between 90 and 125 psi, transmission temperature, parking generator on-off switch, parking brake knob, accessory start switch, reverse neutral drive, and mode up and down indicator. This is a light for the engine bay compartment, let you know when the engine bay compartment is open. Left fan on off, right fan on off, cruise control on off, accelerate throttle. You got your defrost blower motor, low, medium, high. This is the passenger and driver's side defrost switch. This is the recirculate outside switch, and this is the heat on off switch, and this is the heat low, medium, high switch. It's the parking lamp, fog lamp switch, dome light switch, driver dome light switch, strobe light, front power vent, rear power vent, heated mirror switch, guard dome light switch, selector mode indicator, the air condition, defrost and heat switch, and this is the blower motor low, medium, high switch. This is the climate control indicator, low and cool and warm climate control switch. This is the AM FM radio. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 mirrors adjusted to me. You have the windshield, the side windows, the door windows, the driver's side windows. Make sure they have no debris on them. Make sure they're free of debris and have no decals. If so, I'd remove the decals. At this time, I like to perform my parking brake test. Put the vehicle in drive. Bill RPMs up to 1200 RPMs. The vehicle did not move. That indicates that's a successful brake test. This time, I'd like to do my 5 miles an hour service brake test. Put my foot on the brake. Take the parking brake off. Get the vehicle up to 5 miles an hour. Hit the brakes. Vehicle did not pull from one side to the other. That indicates the brakes are properly lined or properly adjusted, and that's a successful brake test.